Hi Phil, and welcome to Queer Magic.
Hello.
It's great to have you on the show, and I know you as author of Chaos. Chaos. I've got a copy of it as well.
Chaos, Condensed Chaos, the
That's it.
Pseudonomicon.
That's the one I've got. Yes.
4 little booklets on the history of chakras, numerous other things. Pagan
Awesome.
News editor for 4 years with Rodney Orpheus.
Yeah, and also pioneer of queer magic.
Well, I don't know about that.
Well, I'd say one of the pioneers. And also your website infolding.org, which has been a very useful resource for me over the years. So cool stuff.
Okay.
So yeah, like tell us a bit about your path through paganism and the occult and adjacent worlds.
Well, that's quite a long story. I mean, I started out doing, if you like, traditional ceremonial magic and Lovecraftian magic, because nothing ever goes quite the same way in my world. And then I moved from there into Wicca. I was in a Alexandrian coven for a few years. I then sort of kind of like gradually got interested in chaos magic by about the early to mid 80s. Spent a few years doing chaos magic and related stuff, and I've spent the last 20 years, I think, concentrated on my hybridized Tantra practice.
Awesome. Amazing. So yeah, and can you tell us a bit about your position on the queer landscape, so to speak?
I don't know that I have a position, really.
Well, I mean, I'm avoiding using the word identity, so...
Okay, well, I thought I was gay for a few years and then settled on bisexual and eventually settled on queer.
Sounds pretty similar.
Kind of like the best, if you like, identifying marker.
Yeah, similar for me. I started out as bisexual. I am bisexual, but I kind of queer is more of a catch-all identity of everything. Yeah. So that's kind of handy. So here's a tricky one for you. Definition of queer magic.
I don't know necessarily that there is one. This is something I've tried to address in my new book, plug Hine's Varieties. As I see it, there's 2 broad ways of looking at it. You can either see queer as a catch-all term to encompass all kinds of non-normative sexualities and gender designations. That's one way of looking at queer magic, I suppose. And the other is queer as a more kind of active process to destabilize, to look for loopholes and gaps and historical discontinuities. It's more of an active process of questioning what we find when we come into a magical space.
Yeah, I like that.
That's more where I'm kind of like coming from, I guess. For example, let's take something that a lot of people take as an immutable occult law, like polarity. Lots of people act as though polarity was just kind of like an immutable cosmic truth, and I go, well, actually, no, it's something that arose out of a particular set of historical circumstances. Let's look at those circumstances. Yeah, very interesting. But is it something that necessarily, as queer folk, we need to take on board? And I would say no. If it works for you, fine. If you can accommodate yourself within that kind of a very dualistic framework, okay. But if you can't, then you don't have to take it on board.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, it's like polarity isn't really part of my magical practice at all. And then people kept saying, but what about, I was starting to talk about inclusive Wicca, and people would go, but what about the polarity? And I'm like, but you can make polarity with anything.
Yeah, what about polarity?
Yeah, what about polarity? Exactly. But like, I've actually did a workshop where we made polarity with people who liked Marmite and people who like chocolate.
Yeah.
You can make, you really can make polarity with absolutely anything.
Yeah, but you don't, as I say, you don't have to ascribe to that
model,
that idea at all. it's just not something that's interesting for me.
Yeah, well, it wasn't to me until people started saying, but what about the polarity? And I'm like, right, okay, then let's demonstrate that you can do it with anything. So and that there are other ways of making magic.
Yes, yeah, of course. And you know, this is something that I started to get a bit ticked off about with my experience in Wicca, because people say, oh well, you know, everything has to be boy girl boy girl boy girl, and I was kind of like, well, hang on, you know.
Yeah.
I actually met one guy who was in he was a gay guy, and he was in one of these very kind of like polarity rule covens, and he said to me, well, when I'm in the circle, I'm straight. And I was like, what? And he goes, yeah, when I'm in the circle, I'm straight. And then when I come out of the circle, I'm not straight anymore. And I thought, okay, I don't want to go there, you know.
Yeah, I just find that whole attitude completely bizarre. Like I've heard that there are groups where people say stuff like that, and I'm just like, no, we're bringing our whole self before the gods. Yeah.
I mean, you know, I have met people who've been in magical groups who've had to completely be in the closet, if you like, sexually speaking, because they knew they wouldn't be accepted. And you know, this is going back a few years, but I was in the 80s. I had a few conversations with this guy who was at the time very well known on the occult and magical scene. You know, written a few books. I'm not going to say who he is because he's not out, I don't think. But he was basically saying, well, my audience are young men who want to learn magic. If they find out I'm gay, they'll go away. And I was just like, that's really terrible, you know.
Yeah, that's really sad. I mean, it's like, get a different audience.
It is very sad. Yeah, and you know, there was one case I remember, a very sad case of a guy who actually committed suicide because he came out as gay to this magical lodge he was in. They went, oh, you know, polarity, karma, block chakras, the whole thing, and he killed himself.
Oh no, that's terrible.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
So when people say to me, oh, what about polarity and this and that and the other, I just go, okay, not interested.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my thing has always been like, you know, people are more important than tradition and more important than your special magical theory that excludes them. It's like,
yeah,
people
exactly.
take priority.
And people are always more complex than your magical model.
You know? Absolutely. Yeah, it's so true. Yeah, so I mean, actually, this all leads in very nicely to my next question, which was, you know, how accommodating have your traditions been of queer identity? And I mean, one of the things I've been pushing for over the last couple of decades really is to make Wicca more inclusive, and other people have been pushing at that door as well. So yeah, I'm not the only one, but I mean, there's still heterocentric nonsense that goes on, unfortunately.
It's an interesting thing about the occult thing. Old ideas get recirculated and, you know, reified all the time. And I think over the years, it depends on the space you're in, you know, and because I started out on my magical path in the late 70s. There were not many out queer people on the magical scene in the UK at that time. So it was kind of a bit tricky, you know. And people weren't questioning these very entrenched attitudes that people had about sexuality and gender. You know, it was all kind of like people just accepted it, and because there were very few people out there challenging it. A lot of people just didn't think, you know, and came out of bullshit. You know, yeah, you get all this stuff about, oh, your chakras are blocked, and you know, karma and plugs and sockets and all that stuff. And I think particularly in the broader pagan movement, there was quite a lot of what I would say unthinking homophobia, and sometimes quite blatant homophobia as well. And that has changed, but I think in Britain, and I'm talking about Britain here because I think the American experience has been very different. In Britain, that's changed very slowly, and a lot of that change has been due to people coming out and challenging it. And you know, nowadays you get this idea that, oh, Wicca and paganism have always been queer friendly, and actually, no, that's not true. And I
No.
would say, you know, that's something that really didn't start changing until the late 90s, maybe early to mid 90s, but you know.
Yeah, I'd say that was about right. I mean, I came into Wicca in the late 80s, early 90s.
Yeah.
And when I started, it was all like, okay, we've all got to stand boy, girl. And I'm like, why? You know, makes no sense. And it wasn't until I'd got a few years under my belt and kind of started to feel confident to push back and say, why are we doing these things? So yeah, and I think late 90s was when it really started to pick up more.
Yeah.
And also, I mean,
Well,
obviously the coming of the
sorry.
internet helped with that, because it meant that we could all connect with each other.
That's very true, and that's been a big sea change. But you know, I remember talking to some of the people who went off and founded Queer Pagan Camp, and the reason that happened was that they just didn't feel safe within the broader pagan community. You know, they wanted a separate space to go and develop their own ideas. And I think, you know, Queer Pagan Camp was very good for that. As you know, this is a welcoming space. This is an inclusive space. You know, and QPC's definition of queer was, you're queer if you say you're queer.
Yeah, and I wish
No,
I'd
it
understood
was
that
all
at the time.
on self-adscription, you know.
Yeah, I really wish I'd understood that at the time, because I didn't pick up on that, and so I never ended up going, and I really regret that, because you know, I didn't feel queer enough, kind of thing. So
They actually ran workshops on on the first two or 3 years I went. There were some great people running, friends of mine, they turned out to be, running workshops on how to be at camp, on how to deal with those feelings of, oh, I'm not pagan enough, I'm not queer enough, you know, all this sort of stuff. And that was a very good part of it, is that they actually acknowledged the difficulties that people had in coming into a very different space. So
yeah,
for me,
and
it was a great, you know, a great learning experience, and a really powerful emotional experience too.
I think Queer
And then
Pagan Camp is one of the most important things to
I
exist.
think so as well, yeah. And you know, I'd really like to see somebody do a history of it.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I know a lot of people who went there, and you know, I was in touch with I've been in touch with Gordon McClellan, and also the other Gordon, who was also involved with Hoblink. And yeah, I mean, Hoblink, really important organization as well.
Again, yeah, I mean, yeah, Hoblink came out of Pagan, of course. You know, I was involved in the inception and the setup and like the creakiness of Hoblink. And again, that's an important, if you like, British queer magical experience that hasn't received much attention. And
Yeah.
you know, I look at a lot of modern queer writing, and it's coming out of the States, which is fine, but I feel there needs to be some attention paid to the British experience. And I'm not saying that from any kind of stupid nationalist perspective, just that, you know, there's a whole hidden history there that I think needs to be written and acknowledged.
Yeah.
There's some friends of mine who are doing a history of Pagan Link at the moment, and they're kind of like getting in touch with all the people who are still surviving, who used to be involved in the Pagan Link network, and they're getting all the, you know, the old newsletters together and interviewing people, and hopefully that's going to produce a very interesting history of Pagan Link. And of course, I think Hoblink will be included in that, because Hoblink kind of came out of Pagan Link.
Yeah. I mean, it was really important to me that these things existed as well.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, as I've more stepped into queer identity, it's been, you know, I felt that as a kind of, oh yeah, this is important.
Yeah, you know, there's other people doing stuff, and I think that's always. I can recall on one occasion, I think Gordon tried to book the London Lesbian and Gay Centre for a Hoblit meeting, and they turned him down because
Wow.
Hoblit included bisexuals.
Yeah. I mean, I
Yeah.
remember the day when I was at university and I tried to go to I went to the Lesbian Society, and they were like, and I'm like, well, why don't we invite the gay men to the group? And they're like, no, can't do that because they're still men. And I'm like, and then, you know, if you're a bisexual, there's still an attitude out there that if you're a bisexual, you're somehow a traitor to the cause. Because I remember going to a queer spirituality event in London in I think the late 90s, and getting flack for being bisexual. So
Yeah.
um
Yeah, I mean, again, that's an interesting thing. Just because people come together in, if you like, in the spirit of queerness, doesn't mean to say there's not going to be arguments.
yeah,
You know, and dissension and falling out and going off in a huff. But I think that for me, that's that acknowledgement that we're not all going to get along is as much a part of the whole queer magic ethos as anything else. You know, to allow for differences.
yeah,
Yeah, we're not going to agree on that. You know, we're not going to agree on this magical point or this idea about sexuality or this idea about activism. But, you know, if we can get beyond that, fine, you know. If
yeah.
not, you go off and create your own little spaces.
It's creating the space to have that conversation. I mean, that's been really important for all kinds of social movements, that you step aside from the mainstream space where nobody understands what you're talking about. You have your own thing, and then you bring that back and enrich and still have your safe space, but also enrich the mainstream with it.
Yeah, it doesn't always, you know, work easily, but
Yeah.
I think that's a good ethos to live by.
Absolutely. And we need those spaces to create stuff.
Yeah.
Totally. So yeah, so your practice of Tantra, how is that, how does that work out with the queerness?
Oh, it's not an issue.
Ah, it's good.
I mean, the practitioner community I'm involved with is like really small at the moment. I mean, you know, I'm in touch with people all over the world through the miracle of the internet, but in terms of people I kind of like physically meet up with and talk to, or Zoom call nowadays, it's actually a really small group. Queerness, it just isn't an issue, you know. I think people have this misconception about Tantra that, you know, because Tantra is all about sex, well, that's a misconception. Then they think, oh, there must be this whole kind of like, if you like, queer element to it, and there isn't, or at least not in the classical texts. It's just not there, you know. Pretty much everything that you see about modern sexual Tantra and gender and identity, anything you can imagine or not score, that's all modern stuff. It's just not present in the classical source literature.
Right.
The
Yeah.
classical source literature deals with a lot of things. It deals with, you know, ritual, yoga, practice, soteriology, the best way to build a temple, that kind of thing. But matters of gender and sexuality, it just doesn't go into at all. Occasionally you get oblique references, but no, there's nothing either laudatory or condemnatory, I would say. It just isn't an issue.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. Yeah. So that's cool. So yeah, would obviously there's been a fair explosion of queer literature and around magic and paganism and the occult. So would you say you had a favorite, or a favorite book in that category?
No, not easily, you know. I mean, I've been influenced by a lot of people. And I don't actually tend to read occult books. I tend to read, critical theory, philosophy, anthropology, and ethnology, stuff like that. I don't read occult books, and they're not, if you like, the primary source of my ideas.
Yeah, I mean that's I think it's really important to read the critical theory stuff as well. I mean, it's like I've got a big thing about archaeology and history. That's a big interest of mine, and also a big fan of science fiction. So and also my background is in undergraduate psychology, and then did a master's in study of religions as well. So, and also some anthropology and archaeology on the side. So yeah, with you on that one.
Okay.
But yes, I think it's interesting that some of the more recent books that have come out on queer sexuality and paganism and the occult have all been from people with a background in those areas. So
yeah, and I think that makes a huge amount of difference.
Yeah.
I mean, I was thinking of, people have said to me over the years, oh, there's not anything too much about sex in your first two chaos magic books. And I go, well, that's true enough. Because I had this idea I was going to do a book on, if you like, chaos sexuality. That was going to be like the follow-up, I guess, to Condensed Chaos. And the more I thought about it, and the more I, read anthropological stuff and contemporary ethnologies and talked to people, I just thought, this is too big a subject, and this is too big a subject to get shoehorned into some simplistic occult theory of sexuality. So I kind of abandoned that project, and I've just settled for writing the odd article since.
Yeah, one of the...
because I think occultists have this kind of like thing as they get a model, whether it be a broadly pagan model or something like the Kabbalah or whatever, and then they try and jam everything into it. And I don't like that approach. I think it's too reductive.
Yeah.
People, as I say, people are too complex to fit in that model. You're always going to find things that you can't account for it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think I once had an idea to kind of produce a Foucauldian system of magic, which maybe one day I will, when I actually get time to finish reading Foucault. Yeah, I think that's totally valid, that, life is complex and messy and doesn't fit neatly into boxes of correspondences. And also one occult system can't be reduced to another occult system.
No, but it doesn't stop people trying that. I don't know, I take a very kind of like, I guess, hard line approach that I don't like it when people try and sum up like Indian ideas about Tantra and sexuality, 2 paragraphs, I just think, well, come on, if you're going to do that, at least, do it thoroughly and do it well, rather than just starting off with a spurious assumption and making what little reading you've done fit that assumption,
Yeah.
I mean, it seems to me highly not perhaps disrespectful, but also dodgy to try and approach a pre-modern culture with contemporary ideas of sexuality and gender and try and jam everything from that culture into our modern ideas,
Yeah, makes sense, because I think you look at the complexity of Tantra and Hindu and Buddhist ideas, and it's like, most people fall at the first hurdle of the whole non-dual perspective that they have on things, because it's like people have tried to explain the whole non-dual thing to me, and I've just gone, I think I understood that, but my brain's just exploded, kind of thing. So
I have that all the time. I've been studying that stuff for 25 years, and a lot of it still does my head in,
Yeah. So yeah, it's very difficult to kind of get past the Western mindset and into the mindset to relate to that, and then trying to sort of shoehorn it back into a Western paradigm of something. It's just like
I think you can do it, but it takes a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and more volume of space than the average paperback. So definitely. Yeah, so tell us about your new book project, because I'm very
Oh, you mean the book that's just been published?
Hine's Varieties, yes.
Hine's Varieties. Okay, well, Hine's Varieties is I guess it's an anthology of my own writings over the last 40 years. Yeah, I've been writing about magic for 40 years now, so I thought would be a nice time to go through my, array of writings, pick out the best bits, or, well, not even the best bits, but the bits I like best, which are not necessarily the same thing, stick them into a book with some, autobiographical meanderings about how I got into this or that path, or, how I got interested in this subject, and try and, contextualize the essay. So, this is what was happening in my life when I wrote this kind of thing. And I wanted to, the book is divided up thematically. So there's a section on paganisms, which includes some activist writing, section on chaos magic, obviously, section on Tantra, section on sexuality, history. I forget all of it, but the idea was to try and show how my ideas have changed over time and in different circumstances. So, the earliest stuff I've got in the sexuality section dates from the early 80s. Hang on, mid 80s, I should say. And the last thing is something I wrote whilst I was writing the book. So, that section spans about 30 years of changing ideas and shifts in emphasis and things like that. And I wanted to make it as autobiographical as possible, to kind of like put myself behind my words, if you like. And I think it's been, I like it as a book. I like rereading it, so, which is, I think, probably a good sign.
Yeah, I read the you kindly sent me the PDF, and I read the section on sexualities, and it was all great. And I particularly thought that the contextualization was really helpful, because for people who haven't been around as long as we have, might be like, what was going on when that was written or whatever, and so that's really helpful. But I also thought the piece on being penetrated was incredibly powerful.
Yeah, a lot of people like that at the time. In fact, I was invited to go on Channel 4 and talk about anal sex, but I declined. That's one of my favorite pieces, actually, because, as I say in the book, I was asked to write something about sex magic for this magazine, and they were like, "Oh no, we can't publish that. That's far too hardcore." And I thought, well, that's kind of a problem I have with a lot of Western writing on sex magic. It's very abstract. There's nothing of the person in it. There's nothing about, how it feels to be having sex in a magical situation, or just having sex,
Yeah.
And so I wanted to do that.
I mean, for me, is that that is my experience of sex, right? So, I mean, was so it's just so great to read that and go, yes, that's it, and somebody gets it from the other side of the biological divide, so to speak. Yeah. So it was really, really powerful for me in that.
Oh, thank you.
So yeah, and just the breadth and depth of what's there was really helpful. And I totally agree with you that I think it would be great to have more out there about Hoblink and stuff.
Well, I think they were very important things for a lot of people, and I think it's easy for those of us who are involved with those networks and groups like QPC to forget that.
Yeah.
Or, they are, if there is such a thing as a British queer magic history, they're things that should be acknowledged.
Absolutely central to it. I mean, it's like just about every queer pagan practitioner that I know has been to queer pagan camp at some point in their magical career. Yeah. So it's hugely important to have that space, and some of the ritual ideas that were developed there. And I mean, you know, I was at Wiccan gathers that I've been to, there's always been like a queer ritual or a queer lunch or some way for the LGBTQ plus folks to get together and talk about our stuff, but it's never long enough. And also noticed that sometime in the early 90s there would be various people who would come to the Wiccan gather once or twice and then go, oh, this is far too heterocentric, I'm off. And then a couple of years later you'd see them on and they'd say, oh yeah, I went to queer pagan camp instead. So you know, and it's like
there was a kind of a backlash, and you'd get people involved in the mainstream pagan thing say, oh, why have you gone and created your own camp, you know, we love you really. But right, you know,
like I vividly remember one particular one of these queer lunches where or workshops where we all got together to talk about queer stuff, and a straight person came along and started asking really basic questions, like, you know, really basic, can't remember what they were, but they were just so basic it was embarrassing. And then we're all kind of sitting there going, could the straight person bugger off please, you know? And it was so frustrating because it was, you know, it was the one queer space that we had in this otherwise rather heterocentric environment. And, you know, so we didn't need people coming and asking 101 questions. It's like maybe we should have had a separate workshop for that. And so, you know, having queer space where we can talk about queer things at a more advanced level, so to speak, is just really important.
One thing that used to happen at QPC that I particularly liked was they would have a kind of like, let's get together in small groups and talk about our paths thing. And the other thing that I thought was really great was there's the approach to workshops. Anybody could run a workshop. You didn't get paid for running a workshop. You didn't get out of having to, you know, do the washing up one night or clear out the organic toilets for doing workshops. People who did workshops were given no preferential treatment, but anybody could run a workshop. I thought that was really great in breaking down that barrier you sometimes get in a lot of spaces between, oh, you know, these are the teaching people who do workshops, who are the advanced practitioners, and, you know, those are the punters. And I think the QPC approach was really interesting for me in the way it kind of tried to break that down.
Yeah, I mean, actually,
really great workshops. I think one of my favorites ever was Enlightenment Through Lipstick.
Awesome.
And it was, a lot of it was very silly, you know. But again, you know, sometimes you need a space for that. Yeah,
absolutely. I think that's really important. And actually, the Wiccan gathers I went to were the same. That, you know, nobody was paid to do a workshop. The payment was you got to go to everybody else's workshops for free. So same principle. But it's just so important. And one of the things that I was moaning about this morning was, you know, like I will run somebody runs a queer ritual, quite often it's me, and then somebody else will go and say, oh yeah, well, it was a really nice ritual, but, you know, it wasn't really Wicca. And it's like, dude, no large group rituals are Wicca. You know, none of the rituals at the gather were Wicca. And anyway, who cares? Because we should be expanding our concept of what Wicca is. But it would just be wonderful to be in a space where that conversation doesn't even need to happen.
And I agree, but, you know, that can take a lot of work to create that space. But when it does work, I think it's intensely magical.
Yeah. And, you know, I think that the thing that queerness has to give the so-called mainstream is the ability to one of the things is the ability to lighten up and be creative and think outside the box.
Yes, and that, you know, that's always, well, not always, but as I became more confident about my own ideas about practicing magic, thinking outside the box has been, you know, tremendously important for me. That's one of the things I liked about chaos magic. It was an opportunity to get beyond the strictures of occultism and bring in things from outside the magical box, like, you know, group dynamics or improvised theatre performance. And
yeah,
that was pretty much the approach I take. Stop reading books on magic, you know, read stuff from outside the magical sphere, bring that in, you know, see if you can have a bit of a laugh, you know, experiment.
I think you were the
Expand your
first
ideas.
person that I think you were the first person that I've ever seen in the British occult scene actually to write about group dynamics. So, so well done.
Well, again, that's because I trained as an occupational therapist. I never practiced as an occupational therapist, but I did train as one, and part of that training was a lot of group dynamics work. So when I started to do workshops in the, when would that be, early 90s, I just basically took a lot of group dynamic stuff, some of which I'd used with clients in psychiatric institutions, and put a magical spin on it.
Yeah, it's
you
awesome.
And me and a friend did a workshop at some pagan conference many years ago on leadership, and we sat people around and said, okay, you're all in groups, you all have leaders, you know, do you have a conversation with the people who are leading your group about your expectations of the leader, your expectations of how the leader should behave? And mostly the response was, oh, no, we've never thought of that. And I think, well, this is group dynamics 101, you know.
Absolutely. I mean, it's something that I've brought up regularly in my books, and I don't see it in a lot of other books. So I think it's.
I was thinking of kind of getting all my, you know, stuff on group dynamics and shoving it in a book, and then I had a conversation with some friend of mine a few years ago, and he said, oh no, you know, I've heard all these horror stories from you and other older pagans about what used to go on in groups. Well, that doesn't happen anymore.
It bloody does.
Kind of like, really? People have changed that much, you know? I might have missed a meeting or two.
It really, really does still go on, and you know, there are plenty. I mean, take the whole Me Too thing, right? There's still recent incidents under the Me Too classification that that are about poor group dynamics, and you know, I mean, I think the person you were talking to is clearly sheltered, either very sheltered or very lucky, because
or perhaps had a rose-tinted view of occult groups.
Yeah,
because you know, we find you know, people in groups behave weirdly because they're in a group, and I think it doesn't matter whether it's a work group, you know, inside a large organization, or a magical group, or just a bunch of friends who meet down the pub. You know, once people get in groups, all kinds of weird shit happens, and that's just a factor of you know, people getting together.
Absolutely. I mean,
and you know, you can get incredible toxic happening within queer groups. You know, we're not. You can be, you know, very self-aware as a queer individual, get into a group with a lot of other self-aware queer individuals. Toxicity happens, you know.
Yeah.
And I think I'm, you know, I don't tend to work in groups nowadays because well, we can't at the moment, but I've kind of like gone away from working in groups. But I think groups can be incredibly powerful and do a lot of good magically. They can also make you crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, QPC devolved into factions and, you know, arguments and so forth. And that's kind of inevitable, I think. Again, unless you work at it, but sometimes not. Sometimes you just can't help it, and people have to go off in different directions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's that the whole forming, norming, storming, and performing thing is bound to happen, and also that you come together for a period
maybe after
of time.
Performing, you get a kind of, you know, going off in a huff.
Yeah, there should be a word for that. The you know, people come together for a common aim as a coalition on some topic, and then they naturally split apart again when those aims don't coincide anymore.
Sure.
So yeah. Yeah, so your website is enfolding.org, and that's been going for
about 10 years now, I think.
Yeah, I think it might be longer actually, because I remember seeing somebody.
2009, I think I first posted, or possibly 2008.
Interesting, because I remember. Well, I must remember the previous iteration of your website then, because I remember somebody sharing an article with me about around about 2004.
Yeah, I mean, I've had like previous iteration websites, which I was going to keep going, and I just thought it's hard enough keeping the blog going, so I kind of like killed off the other websites.
Yeah, I think you must have transferred the article across, because I must have just gone, right, I'm going to link to that again from my list of resources. So, because it's really it's the group dynamics one, and I mean, I've ended up linking to loads of stuff on your website over the years, but there's some fantastic stuff on there.
Me and an old partner of mine did this roundup of homophobic quotes. I think we wrote it in the early 90s, and that's kind of like all over the web now, which is quite nice. But I saw somebody quoting it on Facebook the other day, and I thought, oh well, it's nice to see that people are still, outraged about some of the new age and occult luminaries we'd quoted saying really stupid homophobic things.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that people never actually retract stupid shit that they say. They just kind of pretend they never said it.
Well,
a lot of the time.
Some of the time, yes, or they kind of like weasel around it. There's Gareth Knight wrote this. He wrote what was it? A 2-volume thing on Kabbalistic symbolism. I think in the 70s it first came out. And in there he said, oh, well, homosexuality, like drugs, is a technique of black magic. And then he did this revised edition about 4 years ago. I can't remember who put it out. It was either Weiser or Llewellyn, but one of the big publishers. And he kind of did this kind of like non-apology for it. So he left that in the original. And in his introduction, he's going, oh, well, I'm sorry if anybody was hurt by my remarks, but I felt I had to say something, da, 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 da. And I was like, shut up,
That's so not an apology in any way, is it?
Yeah, it was like a non-apology. It was like one of these guys who's been caught doing something naughty and, I'm sorry I was caught, And he was kind of like, oh, well, I felt I had to speak out on what I thought was happening at the time, And I was like, shut up,
Yes.
So yeah, people don't retract and they don't, or they apologize in a kind of like very weak-willed way, or stuff gets cut out. You get new editions of books where the really homophobic stuff has been kind of like watered down somewhat.
Yeah, you just quietly remove it and don't say anything and hope no one noticed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But all that stuff used to really annoy me, and I think that was kind of good for me because I stopped giving it any credence and just started getting angry instead. So I started to try and work out where some of these ideas had come from, and also to say, actually, we don't have to take this shit anymore.
Absolutely.
Kind of like we're queer and we're wearing black pentagrams, But I remember turning upon some occult thing, wearing leather trousers and in a kind of like silk shirt and a feather boa, and people just looking at me like I was from Mars or something. And they're like, who are you? It's like, oh, I'm Phil Hine. It's like, oh, fuck, And then they kind of like treated me slightly better, but because I was a personality,
Yeah. Sounds like a perfectly acceptable outfit to me. Sounds great.
So. I never could work out what was wrong with wearing leather trousers and a feather boa, but it kind of like doesn't really. You either do femme or butch, but again, I was never one for fitting in with stereotypes.
Yeah, I mean, I've been kind of genderqueer since before the word was invented. So, although I can never quite work out whether I'm genderqueer or gender fluid or non-binary, but you know,
At some point, you just have to say, I can't. You know,
I'm
I'm
me.
happy with what I am. I'm me. You know. And it's the same with the way people, I think, label you as being on this path or that path. I'm not even sure I'm on a path anymore. You know, I'm just kind of like doing what I'm interested in.
Yeah.
But
Yes.
so,
Why
well,
does it
no,
have to have a trajectory, right?
you know, yeah, and you know, which path are you on? What's your tradition? Well, you know, I'm not sure I have one, and I'm
Cool.
not sure that's important for me. You know.
Yeah, I think. I mean, it's kind of. It bugs me when people say, "Oh, you know, because you're a Gardnerian Wiccan, you have to do this, this, and this, and you're not allowed to do that, that, and that." You know, it's like, oh, but how can you be a polytheist and a Wiccan? Well, I am, so deal with it.
It's very. I don't know. I'd never really met any Gardnerian Wiccans. There used to be this guy who came along to the coven. The only thing I can remember about him was he was really into tying people up and scourging them. And he was like, he got really annoyed with me one time because he tied me up and scourged me, and I started moaning ecstatically, and apparently that wasn't the dumb thing to do, but you got to take your pleasure where you can find it, right?
Absolutely. Yes. Well.
You know, if you're going to be scourged, you might as well enjoy it.
Well, yeah.
I thought that was
Absolutely.
the whole point, you know.
Yeah.
Apparently not. You know, stop moaning.
How completely bizarre.
Mm.
Enough to put you off Gardnerians for life, I should think. But thankfully, I mean, it is the whole, that is the whole topic that we could spend another hour discussing, of course. But
Sure.
I do
Well,
find
you
it
can always
kind
get me
of
back another
bizarre
time, you know?
if you're not allowed to enjoy it.
Yeah.
That is very
Well,
odd.
I had some very, very bizarre experiences whilst I was involved in Wicca. Some of, again, which I've written about in the book. Some which were not particularly nice, and that hasn't really put me off Wicca. But it was kind of formative. A lot of those experiences were quite formative for me.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, same. But I guess I just decided to. My thing was, I'm staying right here because I like it here, and I'm going to do my thing, and encourage other people to do their thing
for yourself a space where you can, be happy, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think I came into Wicca at just the point when that was possible because there were other people doing the same. And had I come into Wicca any earlier, I probably would have left it and gone and done something else.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to be honest, I didn't get into Wicca because of any great enthusiasm for it. I got into Wicca because it was like the only thing in town.
Yeah.
I think if there's been a hardcore like Left Hand Path Satanist group, I might have gone for that, but there wasn't a hardcore Left Hand Path Satanist group in Blackpool in the late 70s. There were some Wiccans, and they're the people I ended up with. And I've still got friends who are Wiccans, and some of them still say, "We still think of you as one of us, Phil." That's nice. I can accept that. Don't necessarily agree with you, but it's nice to hear it.
Yeah. Well, you'd certainly be welcome in my circle.
Thank you.
Bit of a hike these days now that I'm in Canada, but yeah, absolutely. So it's been wonderful. Thank you so much for your.
It's my pleasure, and I can always do this again.
Yeah,
if you like.
we can have that other conversation about the scourging.
Yeah.
Yes, and is there anything else you want to add before we go?
I don't think so. Thanks for having me on, Yvonne. It's been a great pleasure talking to you. And if people want to read about what's going through my mind at the moment, they should go to my blog, enfolding.org. I've just done an essay this month on a queer reading of a short story by Saki, who was a very kind of weird figure from the 19th century.
I bloody
Part of the
love
series
Saki.
I'm doing on queer pan literature.
Awesome.
If you want to buy my new book, Hine's Varieties, which is available from Amazon or direct from the publishers, Original Falcon, there's some stuff you might find in there that's interesting from a queer perspective. And failing that, have a nice day.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Completely awesome. Cheers.
Super.
Okay.